On the 2nd of October, 1187, Saladin ibn Ayyub rode into Jerusalem. He did not order a massacre. He did not burn the churches. He did not enslave the population. He wept. 88 years earlier, when the First Crusade had taken Jerusalem in 1099, the victors had killed nearly every person in the city. The streets ran with blood. The chroniclers who recorded it did so with pride. Saladin had spent 20 years working toward this moment. He had unified the fractured Islamic world, defeated the most powerful Christian army in the Middle East, and besieged one of the most fortified cities on earth. And when it was over, he negotiated terms, accepted ransoms, freed the poor who could not pay, and wept at the gates of the city his faith considered holy. This is the story of how that happened, of who Saladin was and where he came from, of the Crusader kingdom he dismantled, the battle that broke it in a single afternoon, and the act of mercy at the end that both his enemies and his own people would remember for 800 years. Jerusalem in the 12th century was not simply a city. It was the intersection of 3 world religions and the justification for a century of warfare. For Christians, it was the site of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the most sacred ground in existence. When news reached Europe in 1095 that Jerusalem was in Muslim hands and that Christian pilgrims were being persecuted, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade. Hundreds of thousands responded. For Muslims, Jerusalem was Al-Quds, the noble sanctuary. The Temple Mount held the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, the place from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven. Its loss to the Crusaders in 1099 was an open wound in the Islamic world, a humiliation that no caliph or sultan had yet been able to avenge. For Jews, it was the city of the Temple, of David and Solomon, a sacred geography of memory and covenant. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, established in 1099, had survived for nearly 80 decades through a combination of military skill, internal discipline, and fortunate timing. It was an island of European feudal culture, planted in the middle of the Islamic world, surrounded, always outnumbered, always conscious that its existence depended on keeping its enemies divided. Saladin would end that. Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born in approximately 1137 in the fortress town of Tikrit on the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. He was Kurdish, not Arab, not from an established dynasty, not from the families that traditionally produced Islamic rulers and warriors. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a military commander in the service of the powerful Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din Zangi. His uncle, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, was one of Nur ad-Din's most capable generals. Saladin, the name means righteousness of the faith, entered history not through conquest but through administration. In 1163, Shirkuh was dispatched to Egypt to intervene in a succession crisis within the Fatimid Caliphate, and he brought his nephew with him. Saladin proved himself an exceptional administrator and political operator. When Shirkuh died in 1171, Saladin, then around 31 years old, was appointed vizier of Egypt, effectively its ruler, by the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid. 2 years later, Al-Adid died, and in a move of extraordinary political calculation, Saladin did not simply take power, he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate entirely. Egypt had been governed by a Shia dynasty for 2 centuries. Saladin, a Sunni, ended it, restored the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to the Friday prayers, and began reshaping Egypt's religious and military institutions in his own image. When Nur ad-Din died in 1774, Saladin moved swiftly to fill the vacuum in Syria. Over the next decade, through a combination of military campaigning and shrewd diplomacy, he brought Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and Yemen under his control. By 1183, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was not merely surrounded, it was encircled. Saladin controlled Egypt to the south, Syria to the north and east, and the routes to the sea. The Crusaders held a strip of coastline and the city that both sides considered the prize. He was patient. He had spent years unifying Islamic Syria and Egypt under one command, and he understood that a premature attack on a united Crusader kingdom would cost him more than he gained. He needed the right moment, and he needed the right provocation. One man was about to provide both. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 1180s was a state under extraordinary internal pressure. Its king, Baldwin IV, was arguably the most remarkable ruler it ever produced. Diagnosed with leprosy as a child, he had reigned since the age of 13 with a ferocious intelligence and military ability that his deteriorating body could barely contain. He fought battles from horseback when he could no longer walk. He administered his kingdom from behind a mask. He knew he was dying. He knew he had no heir, and he spent the last years of his short life trying to prevent his kingdom from tearing itself apart over the succession. Baldwin died in 1185, aged approximately 24. What he left behind was a kingdom divided between 2 factions, those who favored caution and accommodation with Saladin, understanding that the Crusader states could survive only through carefully managed coexistence, and those who believed in aggressive confrontation. The second faction found its champion in Reynald of Chatillon. Reynald was a French adventurer who had arrived on Crusade decades earlier, married his way into the Principality of Antioch, and spent 16 years as a prisoner of Nur ad-Din after a disastrous raid. He emerged from captivity with no apparent lesson learned, and with the lordship of the great desert fortress of Kerak astride the main caravan route between Egypt and Syria. Reynald used this position to attack Muslim caravans in defiance of the truces that the Kingdom of Jerusalem depended on for survival. He launched a naval expedition into the Red Sea, raiding Muslim pilgrimage routes and threatening Mecca itself, a provocation so extreme that it drew condemnation even from some crusaders. He attacked a caravan that, according to the sources, included members of Saladin's own family. Saladin demanded satisfaction from the king. The king demanded that Reynald make restitution. Reynald refused. Saladin swore an oath that he would personally execute Reynald. The countdown to Hattin had begun. Into this deteriorating situation stepped Guy of Lusignan, a weak and inexperienced French noble who had married the heiress Sibylla of Jerusalem, and through her claimed the throne after Baldwin IV's death. Guy was not a bad man, he was simply not equal to the position he found himself in. He lacked the political authority to restrain Reynald. He lacked the military instincts to resist the aggressive counsel of Gerard of Ridefort, the reckless Grand Master of the Knights Templar. and in the summer of 1187 he lacked the judgment to refuse the worst strategic advice in the history of the Crusader states. On June 30th, 1187, Saladin crossed the Jordan River with an army estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000 men and laid siege to the town of Tiberias on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Reynald of Tripoli, one of the most experienced Crusader commanders and the leading voice of the cautious faction, counseled patience. Let Tiberias fall, he argued. The army could not relieve it without marching across 12 miles of waterless plateau in July heat. It was a trap. Gerard of Ridefort told Guy that caution was cowardice, that to abandon Tiberias, where Raymond's own wife was besieged, was dishonor, that God would provide. Guy chose to march. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem rode out to its destruction. The Crusader army that marched from their camp at Safuria toward Tiberias numbered somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men, including around 1,200 knights, the heavy cavalry that was the decisive military instrument of the Crusader states. This was not a border skirmish force. This was everything. Saladin had planned for exactly this. His scouts tracked the Crusader advance. His forces shadowed their flanks, harassing the column with light cavalry and archers, killing horses and men without committing to a pitched engagement. And crucially, he controlled the springs. The road to Tiberias crossed the plateau of Galilee in July heat. 40 degrees Celsius, full armor, horses already exhausted from the previous day's skirmishing. The nearest water was behind them at Safuria, or ahead of them at the Sea of Galilee, or at the small springs of Hattin, which Saladin had already seized and placed behind his lines. The Crusaders had one direction of march and no access to water. By nightfall of July 3rd, the army had failed to reach water. The men lay down in their armor on the dry plateau, tormented by thirst, harassed through the night by Saladin's forces, who lit fires in the dry grass to blow smoke over the Crusader camp. When dawn came on July 4th, the army that rose was already half broken. Reynald of Tripoli led the charge of the cavalry vanguard at dawn, broke through the Muslim lines and rode to safety, the only senior commander to escape. It is still debated whether this was treachery or simply the only militarily rational option available. Either way, the main army was now alone on the plateau. The infantry, maddened by thirst and under constant arrow fire, broke from the column and climbed the twin peaks of the hill of Hattin, the volcanic formation that gave the battle its name. From there they refused to come down, having ceased to function as a fighting force. The knights could not operate without their infantry screen. The army fragmented. What followed was less a battle than a systematic destruction. The Crusader knights charged again and again, and each time the Muslim cavalry parted and let the charges pass harmlessly before resuming the encirclement. By midday, it was over. Guy of Lusignan was captured. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the Crusader states, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross of the crucifixion, carried into battle as a spiritual guarantee of divine protection, was taken. Reynald of Chatillon was captured. Saladin received his prisoners in his tent. He offered Guy a cup of chilled rosewater, a gesture of mercy, indicating that Guy's life would be spared. Guy passed the cup to Reynald, who drank. Saladin told Reynald through a translator that it was Guy who had offered the cup, not he, meaning the protection extended to Guy did not extend to Reynald. He then drew his sword and struck Reynald across the shoulders. His guards finished the execution. The man who had made war inevitable was dead, and the oath Saladin had sworn years earlier was fulfilled. Jerusalem now had no army. In the weeks that followed, the cities of the Crusader coastline fell in quick succession. Acre, Beirut, Sidon, Jaffa, Ascalon. City after city opened its gates or fell to brief sieges. The Crusader kingdom, which had endured for nearly a century, disintegrated in 3 months. What remained was the city itself. Jerusalem, in September 1187, was defended by Balian of Ibelin, a minor Crusader nobleman who had ridden to the city to escort his wife and children to safety, and found himself, almost by accident, the only military commander capable of organizing a defense. There was a complication. Balian had given his word, his oath as a knight, to Saladin personally, that he would not take up arms against him. Saladin, presented with this situation, released Balian from his oath for a period of 1 night to allow him to organize the evacuation of his family, on Balian's promise that he would then leave the city and not return as a combatant. Balian could not leave. The city was in panic. There was no one else. He broke his oath and stayed. Saladin, informed of this, did not treat it as treachery. He accepted the reality of the situation, and the siege proceeded. It was never going to be a long siege. Jerusalem had extensive walls and determined defenders, but almost no trained soldiers. Balian had knighted every boy over 16 and every merchant and townsman with a weapon. The city had perhaps 60 knights and a large civilian population with no military experience. Against Saladin's forces, the outcome was not in question. On the 2nd of October, 1187, Balian rode out to negotiate terms. What he received was extraordinary. Saladin agreed that every inhabitant of Jerusalem could ransom themselves and leave safely. The price was 10 gold dinars per man, 5 for woman, 1 for child. Those who could pay would be escorted to Christian territory. Those who could not would be enslaved. Balian asked what would happen to the approximately 15,000 inhabitants too poor to pay. He argued, with considerable audacity given his position, that if Saladin enslaved them, he and the remaining defenders would destroy the city rather than surrender it. They would slaughter the Muslim prisoners in the city, tear down the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and burn everything that could be burned. It was an extraordinary bluff from a man in no position to make threats. Saladin accepted the idea of a lump sum payment for the bulk of the poor. His brother Al-Adil asked for 1,000 slaves as a personal gift and then freed them all. Saladin himself freed another 1,000. Then, as the procession of refugees streamed out of the city, he freed the elderly who could not make the journey. The historians who recorded these events noted that his own emirs were astonished. The contrast with 1099 was impossible to miss. When the first Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, the chronicler Raymond d'Aguillet had written that the victorious soldiers waded through blood up to the bridles of their horses. Every Muslim and Jewish inhabitant of the city had been killed. The slaughter had been so complete that it had shocked even other crusaders. In 1187, Saladin walked into the same city and wept. He restored the crescent to the dome of the rock. He prayed at Al-Aqsa Mosque. He ordered that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the most sacred site in Christendom, built over the site of the crucifixion and resurrection, be left open to Christian pilgrims. He prohibited looting. He left the Christian holy sites intact. A medieval Muslim chronicler, Imad ad-Din, wrote that Saladin's mercy at Jerusalem was an act that would be remembered by both his friends and his enemies. He was correct. Richard I of England, who would come to fight Saladin 2 years later, would speak of him with a respect he reserved for almost no one. The news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe within weeks and produced a response of enormous scale. Pope Gregory VIII issued a papal bull calling for a new crusade. 3 of the most powerful monarchs in Europe responded: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, known as the Lionheart. Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, and most of his army went home. Philip and Richard arrived by sea in 1191. What followed, the Third Crusade, was 2 years of campaigning that produced no decisive result, despite containing some of the finest generalship the medieval world had seen. Richard was a commander of genuine genius. He won the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, maintaining discipline under sustained Saracen arrow fire and launching a perfectly timed countercharge that broke the Muslim formation. He retook the coastal cities and rebuilt Crusader power along the Palestinian shoreline. He advanced to within 12 miles of Jerusalem, twice, and twice he stopped. Richard understood, even as his army clamored for the final assault, that taking Jerusalem would not solve the fundamental strategic problem, that the Crusaders could not hold it. Their supply lines ran through the coast. The moment a relieving Christian force left, Saladin's army would return. Jerusalem without a defensible hinterland was a symbolic victory that would become a military liability. The 2 men negotiated. Through intermediaries, they never met in person, though Richard proposed at one point that his sister marry Saladin's brother Al-Adil, a proposal that went nowhere but reveals the extraordinary nature of their exchange. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, gave the Crusaders control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. Unarmed Christian pilgrims would be permitted to visit the holy sites. Both sides recognized the other as a legitimate power. Richard left Palestine in October 1192. Saladin died on the 4th of March 1193, less than 6 months later. He was found to have almost no money. An inventory of his possessions listed 1 gold piece and 47 silver dirhams, not enough to pay for his own funeral. He had given everything away. The man who had controlled Egypt, Syria, and Yemen, who had commanded armies of tens of thousands, died with less personal wealth than many of his soldiers. Saladin occupies a singular position in the historical memory of both the Islamic world and the West, one of the very few figures from the medieval period who is remembered with respect by the descendants of his enemies as well as his own people. In Islamic tradition, he is the model of the just ruler and the mujahid, the one who fights for the faith, who succeeded not merely through military power, but through the quality of his character. In Western tradition, romanticized almost from the moment of his death, he became the archetype of the noble enemy, fierce in battle, generous in victory, a man whose mercy his opponents found difficult to explain through the framework they had built to justify the Crusades. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem would limp on for various diminished forms for another century. Acre finally fell in 1291, but the coherent, confident Crusader state that had existed before Hattin never recovered. The Battle of July 4, 1187, broke something that could not be repaired. What Saladin had done was not simply military. He had unified a fractured Islamic world for long enough to do what no ruler had managed in nearly a century, and he had done it with enough moral clarity that the act retained its meaning. The city he took back is still contested, still fought over, still the center of a conflict that has not ended. He retook it for 45 days, less than 6 years, and it has never entirely left his shadow. The story of the Crusades did not end with Saladin's death or even with the Third Crusade. The Fourth Crusade, which we have covered in a previous episode, would take a remarkable turn that had nothing to do with Jerusalem at all. And the later history of Saladin's own dynasty, the Ayyubids, and the forces that eventually succeeded them would reshape the Islamic world in ways that are still visible today. Those episodes are on their way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members whose support make the creation of these documentaries possible. If you would like to join them, the links are in the description. This is the Hattin channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.